November 30th, 1943. Tehran, Iran. Deep within the fortified basement of the Soviet embassy, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commander, pauses mid-signature on a critical operational report. His pen hovers over words that would never appear in any official Soviet document, a private confession that could be considered treasonous if spoken too loudly. Without the 400,000 trucks we are receiving from the Americans, this offensive would be impossible. We are moving our armies on American wheels. Through the reinforced embassy window, the distant, rhythmic growl of American-built Studebaker engines rumbles through the dusty streets of Tehran. These trucks are carrying vital supplies for the conference where Stalin is set to meet Roosevelt and Churchill. In that precise moment, Zhukov confronts a reality that would remain buried in classified archives for nearly 50 years. The Red Army, currently pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin in a wave of vengeance, is rolling on American chassis, burning American fuel, and eating American canned food. Without this logistical lifeline, as Stalin himself would admit in a private toast just hours later, the Soviet Union would have lost the war. The scale of this aid was nothing short of a logistical tsunami. 427,284 American trucks and jeeps would eventually cross the treacherous Arctic convoys, navigate the scorching Persian Corridor, and traverse the Pacific route into Soviet hands. This was more vehicles than the Soviet Union produced during the entire war. In fact, it was more trucks than most nations possessed in their total inventory. These machines would transform the Red Army from a sluggish force that moved at the speed of marching boots and exhausted horses into a mechanized avalanche capable of sustaining high-speed operations across thousand-mile fronts. But what none of the Soviet officers present that day in Tehran could have imagined was that their private admissions about American aid were being carefully recorded. They were being documented not just by American stenographers, but by their own NKVD agents, creating a secret internal record that would flatly contradict decades of post-war Soviet propaganda about the Great Patriotic War. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, we must go back to where the nightmare began. The truth about Soviet transportation started with absolute catastrophe. On June 22, 1941, the silence of the frontier was shattered as 3.8 million Axis soldiers crashed across the border in Operation Barbarossa. They found a Red Army woefully unprepared for the realities of modern, mechanized warfare. The Soviet truck fleet, numbering approximately 700,000 vehicles on paper, was in reality a logistical ghost town. It consisted primarily of the GAZAA, a licensed copy of the obsolete 1930 Ford Model A, and the ZIS-5, a rugged but slow truck based on American designs from the 1920s. These vehicles were underpowered and ill-equipped for the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Within just 6 months of the invasion, 40% of this fleet lay destroyed in ditches, burning on roadsides, or captured by the advancing Germans. The numbers told a story of industrial inadequacy that Soviet propaganda would spend the next half-century trying to erase. In 1941, the Soviet Union managed to produce just 124,176 trucks, while losing nearly 300,000 in the chaos of retreat. The situation was desperate. The GAZ factory in Gorky, the nation's primary truck manufacturer, had to be frantically evacuated eastward as German forces approached, cutting production to a mere trickle. Meanwhile, the ZIS factory in Moscow was forced to convert almost entirely to tank production as the Wehrmacht stood at the very gates of the city. The Red Army was fighting for its life, and it was quickly running out of the means to move. By early 1942, the reality on the ground was grim. Entire Soviet armies were moving on foot, their heavy artillery pulled by exhausted horses, when horses could be found at all. The logistics had collapsed to a pre-industrial level. The tragedy of the Second Shock Army, trapped in the freezing swamps of the Volkhov Pocket, illustrated this horror perfectly. While attempting to break out of the encirclement, they lost 95% of their transport capacity. It devolved into a nightmare where starving soldiers were forced to carry heavy artillery shells on their backs through waist-deep snow for guns they could no longer move. This was the broken, unmotorized Red Army that American aid would eventually transform, though it would take Soviet leaders 40 years to publicly acknowledge the source of that transformation. The Wehrmacht's mechanized spearheads had already demonstrated to the world what modern warfare required, mobility, speed, and relentless logistics. Soviet forces, despite their numerical superiority in many categories, found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered and encircled simply because they could not match German mobility. Infantry divisions that appeared motorized on paper marched on foot. Artillery batteries that required prime movers relied on horses that died by the thousands in the brutal Russian winter, freezing where they fell. But the tide began to turn in the frozen north. October 1st, 1941. Arkhangelsk Port, Soviet Arctic. Under the cover of the polar night, the British convoy PQ-1 discharged its cargo onto the icy docks. 20 American trucks, the very first drops of what would become a flood, rolled onto Soviet soil. These Chevrolets, with their enclosed, heated cabs and reliable engines, seemed like alien technology to Soviet drivers accustomed to domestic vehicles that required hours of maintenance for every single hour of operation. By November 1941, even as the Wehrmacht stood just 12 miles from the Kremlin, spying the spires of Moscow through their binoculars, American trucks were already arriving. The flow quickly escalated to a staggering rate of 2,000 vehicles per month through multiple lifelines. The Persian Corridor, now managed by American engineers who had effectively taken over the Iranian State Railway, saw its capacity skyrocket by 600%. The Pacific route, though diplomatically limited to non-military supplies due to the delicate neutrality between the Soviets and the Japanese, still moved thousands of chassis. And the dangerous Arctic convoys, despite suffering horrific losses to U-boat wolf packs and Luftwaffe airstrikes, continued to deliver their precious cargo through the ice. The vehicles themselves represented a technological leap that Soviet mechanics could barely comprehend. The star of the show, the Studebaker US6, featured six-wheel drive, all six wheels powered, compared to the standard Soviet truck which drove only the rear four wheels. The American engine produced 94 horsepower versus the 73 horsepower of the Soviet ZS-5. But most critically, the American trucks came equipped with front-mounted self-recovery winches. This allowed them to pull themselves, and others, out of the deep Russian Rasputitsa mud that would trap Soviet vehicles until spring. The attention to detail shocked the Russians. These trucks came fully equipped with things Soviet forces had never seen attached to a vehicle: complete 128-piece toolkits, heavy-duty hydraulic jacks, tire repair equipment, and spare parts catalogs with clearly numbered components. A Soviet truck, by comparison, came with basic hand tools, if it came with tools at all. The Americans had thought of everything: cold weather starting equipment, cabin heaters that actually kept drivers from freezing, and sealed electrical systems that didn't short out in the wet slush. The Tehran Conference of November 28 to December 1, 1943, produced one of the most extraordinary admissions in Soviet history. It was a moment of candor that would remain classified in American archives until 1961, and unpublished in the Soviet Union until 1989. During a private dinner on November 30th, with only Roosevelt, Churchill, and their closest advisors present, Stalin rose for a toast that directly contradicted everything Soviet propaganda would claim for the next half-century. According to Charles Bolin, Roosevelt's interpreter, Stalin raised his glass and declared, "I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war. The most important things in this war are the machines. The United States has proven that it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can only turn out, at most, 3,000 airplanes a month. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded in his diary that Stalin specifically emphasized trucks during the technical discussions that followed. The Soviet leader stated that the American Studebakers were, quote, "the best trucks in the world for our conditions," calling them the absolute foundation of Soviet mobility. Yet, just 3 years later in 1946, Stalin would publicly declare that Lend-Lease had been merely supplementary, claiming it represented only about 10% of Soviet production. This lie would become Soviet orthodoxy, rigidly enforced by censors and historians who knew the truth, but valued their careers and their lives more than historical accuracy. The Tehran Conference records also revealed other crucial admissions. Marshal Clement Voroshilov told American logistics officers, "Your trucks are winning the war for us." One American truck is worth 10 light tanks to us. This admission came from a military leader who, in public, credited only Soviet industry with victory. To understand why American trucks proved so decisive, one must grasp the brutal arithmetic of Soviet logistics. A single Soviet rifle division on the attack required 450 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, food, fuel, and medical gear. In defense, it still needed 300 tons. A tank corps required a staggering 1,000 tons every single day. Moving these supplies from railheads to the front lines across the Soviet Union's primitive road network required trucks. Major General Andrei Krylev, chief of Soviet military logistics, compiled statistics in 1943 that remained classified until 1991. His report revealed the stark mathematics of survival. The Red Army required a minimum of 450,000 trucks for offensive operations. However, Soviet production from January to September 1943 totaled just 49,000 vehicles. American deliveries in the same period, 94,000 vehicles. Without American wheels, Soviet forces simply could not operate beyond 50 kilometers from rail lines. The qualitative difference mattered just as much as the quantity. Soviet trucks, primarily the ZIS-5 and GAZAA, had cargo capacities of 2.5 to 3 tons on paper, but rarely carried more than 1.5 tons on rough frontline roads without breaking down. The American Studebaker US6, rated at 2.5 tons, routinely carried 5 tons on good roads and 3 tons cross-country. Even more critical was reliability. The mean time between failures for the Studebaker was 10,000 kilometers. For Soviet trucks, it was just 2,000. The mechanical superiority extended beyond reliability. American trucks featured innovations Soviet designers hadn't even imagined: air brakes that worked in any weather, aluminum pistons that reduced engine weight, oil filters that actually filtered, and thermostats that maintained optimal engine temperature. By contrast, Soviet trucks had mechanical brakes that failed when wet, heavy cast iron pistons, settling tanks that rarely worked, and engines that ran too cold in winter and overheated in summer. While the Arctic convoys captured the public imagination with their desperate battles against U-boats, the Persian Corridor quietly became the primary route for American trucks reaching Soviet forces. This 4,000-mile supply line, stretching from American ports through Iran to the Soviet border, represented one of the greatest logistical achievements in military history. American engineers transformed Iran's primitive infrastructure in a matter of months. They inherited a single-track railway moving just 200 tons daily and increased its capacity to 6,000 tons. They built highways where only camel paths existed. They constructed assembly plants in the desert that could process 300 trucks daily. The truck assembly plant at Andameshk became the ultimate symbol of American industrial might, transplanted to the Middle East. Soviet drivers would arrive after grueling journeys from the Caucasus, receive 3 days of intensive training on American vehicles, and then drive their new trucks 1,800 miles back to the front lines. The cultural shock was profound. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to vehicles that required constant repair, suddenly commanded machines that simply worked. By mid-1943, the Persian Corridor was no longer just a supply line. It was delivering thousands of trucks every single month. The port of Khorramshahr, which had handled a modest 50,000 tons annually before the war, was now processing an incredible 250,000 tons per month. American efficiency absolutely stunned the Soviet liaison officers. They reported back to Moscow in disbelief about dock operations where ships were fully unloaded in just 48 hours, tasks that routinely took Soviet ports 2 weeks to complete. The total number of vehicles delivered through this route reached into the tens of thousands, with estimates suggesting that nearly half of all American trucks that reached the Soviet Union came via Iran. The corridor operated with a clockwork efficiency that Soviet logistics officers studied intensely and tried to replicate, though they tragically lacked the industrial infrastructure to match American methods. But perhaps the most lethal result of this aid was the marriage of American trucks to Soviet rocket artillery, creating one of the most feared weapons of World War II. The legendary BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher had originally been mounted on domestic ZIS-6 trucks, but production of that vehicle had ceased in late 1941. The handful of rail-mounted and towed versions that followed proved nearly useless in the fluid chaos of mobile warfare. The Studebaker US6 changed everything. Its reinforced chassis was robust enough to handle the violent, shaking recoil of a full rocket salvo without cracking. Its six-wheel drive allowed it to fire from rough terrain and, crucially, relocate before German counterbattery fire could zero in. The cross-country performance of the Studebaker was so superior that it became the official standardized mount in 1943, designated the BM13N, where the N stood for normalizovaný, or standardized. More than 1,800 of these Studebaker-mounted systems were manufactured by the war's end. The impact on survival was dramatic. Guards mortar units equipped with Studebaker-mounted Katyushas achieved survival rates 400% higher than those stuck with Soviet vehicles. The ability to shoot and scoot, to fire a devastating salvo and relocate within 3 minutes, depended entirely on reliable vehicles. Soviet trucks, when they worked at all, often needed 15 minutes for the same evolution, leaving their crews exposed to deadly retaliation. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. German soldiers called them Stalin's organs for the screaming sound they made, but they noted with dread that these weapons now rode on American trucks that they couldn't catch. The standardization on American chassis revolutionized Soviet rocket artillery logistics. One manual, one set of parts, and one type of training replaced the desperate improvisation of the early war. Analyzing production statistics reveals the mathematical impossibility of a Soviet victory without these American trucks. The numbers tell a stark story. Soviet vehicle production during the war was anemic. From June 22 to the end of 1941, they built approximately 46,100 vehicles. In 1942, that number dropped to 32,300. It recovered slightly in 1943 to 41,600 and reached 57,400 in 1944. Total wartime Soviet truck production reached approximately 205,000 units. This was less than half the American contribution of 427,284 vehicles. Against this production, losses were catastrophic. The Red Army lost nearly 300,000 vehicles in 1941 alone, with continued attrition bringing total wartime losses to over 500,000 vehicles. The math is inescapable. Without American deliveries, the Soviet vehicle park would have shrunk to effectively nothing by mid-1942, leaving the Red Army immobile and defenseless. Every Soviet offensive after Stalingrad depended on American wheels. By 1945, American-built vehicles comprised 33% of the Red Army's total vehicle fleet. However, raw numbers are misleading. In reality, these trucks represented a staggering 70% of the Army's actual transport capacity due to their superior load-carrying ability and mechanical reliability. The economic dimension was equally critical. A single Studebaker US6 cost $1,830 to produce in 1943. The Soviet Union received them effectively for free through Lend-Lease. To produce equivalent vehicles domestically would have cost the Soviet Union massive amounts of raw materials and factory hours, resources that were desperately needed for tank and aircraft production. Plus, it required an industrial precision that the USSR simply didn't possess at that time. Operation Bagration, launched on June 23, 1944, demonstrated definitively that American trucks had transformed Soviet operational capability. This massive offensive, which obliterated German Army Group Center and inflicted 450,000 casualties, would have been logistically impossible without American vehicles. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's operational planning showed the mathematical dependency clearly. His first Belarusian front required 12,000 tons of supplies daily. Soviet railways could only deliver to depots located 60 to 100 kilometers behind the lines. From that point on, only trucks could maintain the advance. Rokossovsky had amassed 19,000 trucks for the operation, and 14,000 of them were American. The speed of the advance, 450 kilometers in just 5 weeks, completely overwhelmed German planning. The Wehrmacht assumed Soviet forces would need operational pauses every 100 to 150 kilometers to rebuild their logistics tail. Wehrmacht intelligence had calculated Soviet offensive capability based on domestic Soviet truck production rates, not knowing that American vehicles had effectively tripled the Red Army's transport capacity. During the 5 weeks of Bagration, American trucks in Soviet service carried 400,000 tons of ammunition and 300,000 tons of food, while simultaneously evacuating 250,000 wounded soldiers from the battlefield. They consumed 67,000 tons of fuel, which was itself delivered largely by other American tanker trucks. The math is brutal. Soviet truck production for the entire year of 1944 could not have sustained this single offensive for even 1 week. The contrast with earlier operations was stark. The failed Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942 had stalled partly because Soviet forces outran their logistics within days, leaving their tanks without fuel and their guns without shells. By 1944, thanks to American trucks, Soviet forces could maintain offensive momentum for weeks on end, turning tactical victories into strategic triumphs. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated commander, left 3 separate testimonies about American aid that remained hidden until the Soviet collapse. Each added details that demolished the post-war myth of Soviet self-sufficiency. The first of these emerged from secret KGB surveillance transcripts. In 1963, during a private conversation at his dacha, unaware that hidden microphones were recording his every word, Marshal Zhukov stated, "People say that the Allies didn't help us. But it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us material without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with." The second testimony came in a series of candid interviews with the writer Konstantin Simonov between 1965 and 1966. These tape recordings remained suppressed by the state until 1990. In them, Zhukov was explicit: without American Studebakers, we could have dragged our artillery nowhere. To a considerable degree, they provided our front transport. The third account appeared in Zhukov's unpublished manuscript, which was seized by the KGB in 1969 and locked in secret archives until 1992. Analyzing the Battle of Berlin, Zhukov wrote about the critical importance of American trucks in delivering 2.2 million artillery shells in just 2 weeks. A logistical feat possible only with American vehicles making continuous, high-speed supply runs. But perhaps the most comprehensive admission came from Nikita Khrushchev. His secretly recorded memoirs, smuggled to the West in 1970, contained a bombshell confession about Soviet dependence on American aid. His testimony was later authenticated through voice analysis and corroborating sources after the Soviet collapse. I would like to express my candid opinion about Stalin's views on whether the Red Army and the Soviet Union could have coped with Nazi Germany and survived the war without aid from the United States and Britain, Khrushchev stated. He continued bluntly, "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. If we had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could not have stood up against Germany's pressure, and we would have lost the war." Khrushchev specifically addressed the truck issue. No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never, I think, left any written traces of his opinion. But I can say that he expressed this view several times in conversations with me. Our losses would have been colossal because we would have had no maneuverability. It is a profound historical irony that this same Khrushchev, during his time as Soviet Premier, would publicly declare that the Soviet Union accomplished victory entirely with its own resources. It was a contradiction that epitomized the Soviet schizophrenia about American aid: rely on it for survival, but deny its existence for ideology. However, the Soviet mechanics who maintained these trucks understood the truth better than the politicians. They saw the technological chasm between American and Soviet automotive engineering every day. American engines used lightweight aluminum pistons. Soviet engines used heavy cast iron. American trucks had sophisticated oil filters. Soviet trucks relied on primitive settling tanks. American vehicles featured sealed wheel bearings designed to last 50,000 kilometers. Soviet bearings were lucky to last 5,000. The spare parts system alone amazed Soviet mechanics. The Americans sent detailed catalogs showing every single part with a specific reference number, order by number, and the exact part arrives. The Soviet system was archaic by comparison: cannibalize broken vehicles for scraps, or manufacture the part by hand in a field workshop. The American trucks even included safety equipment that Soviet designers had never considered: safety glass, mirrors on both sides, backup lights, and horns operable with one hand. Beyond the immediate military impact, American trucks revolutionized Soviet automotive thinking forever. Soviet engineers spent years studying American vehicles, learning lessons that would influence post-war Soviet truck design for decades. The ZIS-150, the Soviet Union's first post-war mass-produced truck, was essentially a Soviet interpretation of American design principles learned from the Studebaker. American trucks introduced a maintenance culture previously unknown in Soviet practice: preventive maintenance schedules, systematic inspections, and parts standardization. These concepts came directly from studying the machines that rolled across the Persian Corridor. In the end, the Red Army marched into Berlin on American wheels. And while the history books were rewritten to hide this fact, the legacy of that aid remained embedded in the very industrial DNA of the Soviet Union. The Soviet failure in the 1939 Winter War against Finland had ruthlessly exposed a catastrophic logistics weakness. Unable to supply troops just 150 kilometers from Leningrad, the Red Army suffered a humiliating disaster, with 126,875 dead and 264,908 wounded against Finnish forces one-tenth their size. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's post-war analysis identified the shortage of trucks as the critical failure point. Soviet forces possessed numerical superiority, but they simply couldn't concentrate their power due to transport limitations. By 1944, however, American trucks had solved the problems exposed in Finland. The successful Soviet offensive against Finnish forces in June 1944 succeeded precisely because American vehicles maintained supply lines through the very same rough terrain that had defeated Soviet logistics 4 years earlier. Soviet propaganda often claimed railways, not trucks, were the key to logistics, deliberately minimizing the importance of American vehicles. But declassified General Staff studies reveal why this was physically impossible. The retreating Germans destroyed 65,000 kilometers of track, 13,000 bridges, and 4,100 stations. While Soviet railway troops performed miracles, restoring about 20 kilometers of track daily under combat conditions, these restored single-track lines could only handle 6 to 8 trains daily, compared to 40 or 50 trains on intact, double-track routes. More critically, railways always ended at fixed points. The final 50 to 100 kilometers to the combat units required trucks. No trucks meant no supplies at the front. The Germans learned this lesson fatally. Their excellent railway engineers kept pace initially, but their lack of trucks meant supplies accumulated uselessly at railheads, rotting in the snow while combat units just a few miles away starved for ammunition. While the massive Studebakers captured the Soviet imagination, the full range of American vehicles proved equally important. The 51,503 Willys Jeeps revolutionized reconnaissance and command functions. The 69,000 Dodge 3/4-ton trucks provided tactical mobility for infantry squads, while 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-ton vehicles served as the dependable divisional workhorses. Marshal Ivan Konov noted that Jeeps allowed real-time battle control, enabling commanders to visit multiple divisions in a single day, accelerating the command cycle and providing a decisive speed advantage over the Germans. Despite this, the systematic suppression of Lend-Lease acknowledgement began even before the war ended. In February 1945, the State Defense Committee issued Secret Order No. 7572, all photographs of foreign equipment to be censored from publication. Soviet industry alone must be credited with victory. This initiated a 40-year campaign to erase American trucks from Soviet war memory. Photo censors meticulously painted over American vehicles in official images, replacing them with drawings of Soviet equipment. Films showing American trucks were edited or destroyed. Veterans' memoirs were heavily censored to remove any references to foreign aid. The suppression extended to the statistics themselves. The official 1960 Soviet history claimed Lend-Lease represented only 4% of Soviet wartime production. This figure was achieved through a cynical accounting manipulation. They compared American deliveries to total Soviet production, including irrelevant civilian goods, and used arbitrary ruble values that vastly undervalued the American equipment. When veterans submitted memoirs describing their time in American vehicles, editors systematically replaced specific references with vague terms. Studebaker became just truck. American vehicles became our vehicles. Entire passages were rewritten to eliminate any hint of foreign aid. As Cold War tensions escalated, the suppression only intensified. By 1948, the narrative had been sealed. Politburo member Nikolai Voznesensky issued official reports claiming Lend-Lease represented nearly 4% of Soviet production, while simultaneously denouncing America as the leader of the anti-democratic camp. This 4% figure became the official party line for 4 decades. Soviet historians who knew the truth faced an impossible choice: repeat the lies or risk their careers, and often their freedom. Most chose safety, producing sanitized histories that credited Soviet industry alone with victory. The distortion deeply affected education. Generations of Soviet school children learned that their nation defeated Hitler essentially alone. Museums proudly displayed captured German panthers and tigers, but hid the American trucks that had made the victories possible. War memorials celebrated the T-34 tank, but never mentioned the humble Studebakers that carried the ammunition, fuel, and soldiers to the front. It wasn't until Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost that honest discussion was finally permitted. In 1989, the Military History Journal published the Tehran Conference transcripts, officially revealing Stalin's private admission for the first time. The reaction was explosive. Soviet readers discovered their entire understanding of the war's logistics was built on omissions. Veterans finally felt safe to speak the truth. At a 1990 Moscow reunion, former drivers stood and testified emotionally about their American trucks, revealing stories of survival and reliability that had been hidden for 45 years. The archival revelations were stunning. Researchers discovered a system of dual bookkeeping, real statistics for internal planning, and false ones for public consumption. The real numbers showed that American trucks comprised nearly 70% of the Red Army's effective transport capacity by 1945. Historian Dr. Boris Sokolov, examining these newly opened archives, calculated a definitive conclusion: remove American trucks from the Soviet military, and every offensive after Stalingrad fails. The Red Army marched to Berlin on American boots and rode on American wheels. The Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945 provided the ultimate demonstration of this dependency. The logistics requirements were staggering. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers and 41,600 artillery pieces required continuous supply across hundreds of miles of destroyed German territory. Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front alone required 25,000 tons of supplies daily. His logistics network included 22,000 trucks, and 16,000 of them were American. The ammunition expenditure was apocalyptic: 2.5 million artillery shells fired in just the first week. This required trucks to make continuous runs under fire. Logistics logs show that each American truck averaged 4 supply runs daily, a 100-kilometer round trip each time. Soviet trucks, when operational, managed only 1 run before requiring maintenance or breaking down. Even in the moment of ultimate victory, the dependency remained visible. The victory parade through the ruins of Berlin was accomplished largely with American vehicles, simply because they were the most presentable and the most reliable machines available. Soviet forces conquered Hitler's capital riding Roosevelt's trucks. The complete accounting of American aid, finally revealed in full after the Soviet collapse, was staggering. The final tally included 427,284 trucks and jeeps, 13,303 combat vehicles, 35,170 motorcycles, and 2,328 ordnance service vehicles. But it went beyond vehicles. The aid included 2.7 million tons of petroleum products to fuel the army, 4.5 million tons of food to feed the soldiers, 1,911 steam locomotives and 11,075 railroad cars to move the reserves. Perhaps most personally for the infantry, it included 15.4 million pairs of boots. The vehicle deliveries alone represented more trucks than Germany produced during the entire war, enough transport to completely motorize 60 rifle divisions. By the war's end, American vehicles had transported 60% of all Soviet ammunition, moved 70% of all fuel, evacuated 65% of the wounded, and towed 58% of all artillery pieces. In the immediate flushing of victory, grateful Soviet officials had actually proposed monuments to this aid. Marshal Zhukov himself suggested a grand memorial to the Allied arsenal of democracy. That monument was never built in stone. Instead, it was buried in the archives, hidden by politics, and erased from history, until now. The Communist Party rejected all such proposals. For 45 years, not a single monument stood to acknowledge the role of American trucks. Only in 2004 was a modest Lend-Lease memorial finally unveiled in Murmansk. Even then, controversy erupted. The absence of monuments reflected a deeper tragedy, the theft of historical memory. Millions of Soviet citizens grew up believing their nation defeated Hitler entirely alone. As the last veterans began to pass away, their testimonies became precious historical documents. At a 2005 gathering in Moscow, the remaining drivers formed the Studebaker Brotherhood to preserve the true history of the war. They collected photographs that had been hidden for 60 years, showing American vehicles still bearing their original markings. Their final statement, signed by 200 frail but proud veterans, declared, "We rode American trucks to victory. We ate American food. We fired American ammunition." This is not a diminishment of Soviet sacrifice. 27 million of our people died, but truth honors their memory better than lies. American trucks helped save our motherland. Today, as Russia again revises World War II history for political purposes, the Lend-Lease story carries renewed relevance. Modern Russian textbooks minimize American aid even more aggressively than Soviet ones did, part of a broader campaign to restore national pride through historical mythology. Yet, the mathematical facts remain unchanged. The documented delivery of 427,284 American vehicles, more than double the total Soviet wartime production of 205,000 trucks, cannot be erased. The testimonies of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov, preserved in multiple archives, cannot be denied. The truth serves as a reminder that international cooperation, not isolation, defeated fascism. The American trucks that carried Soviet soldiers to victory were products of the arsenal of democracy, shared freely with an ally despite deep ideological differences. The story of American trucks in Soviet service transcends military logistics. It demonstrates how industrial capacity wins modern wars, how ideology distorts history, and how truth eventually emerges despite decades of suppression. The 427,284 American trucks and jeeps that reached the Soviet Union represented the razor-thin margin between victory and defeat on the Eastern Front. They transformed the Red Army from a World War I-style force dependent on railways and horses into a modern, mechanized avalanche capable of sustained offensive operations across continental distances. Soviet leaders knew this truth intimately. Stalin admitted at Tehran that without American machines, we would have lost the war. Zhukov confessed that without American trucks, Soviet forces wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with. Khrushchev acknowledged that without American aid, the Soviet Union could not have withstood German pressure. Yet for 45 years, the Soviet Union maintained a false narrative. Photos were doctored, memoirs were censored, and statistics were falsified. The Communist Party stole the true history of their victory from its own people, replacing it with a mythology that served political purposes but dishonored historical truth. Only with Glasnost did the full reality emerge from the archives, recordings, and testimonies. The evidence proved overwhelmingly that American trucks didn't just assist the Soviet war effort, they enabled it. The Studebakers, which Soviet soldiers affectionately called Studer and praised as vehicles that could go anywhere, were as essential to victory as the T-34 tanks celebrated in every memorial. The suppression and eventual revelation of this truth carries lessons that extend far beyond military history. It demonstrates exactly how authoritarian regimes manipulate collective memory, how political necessities override historical accuracy, and yet, how the truth ultimately emerges despite decades of official suppression. Today, the mathematical fact remains indisputable. Soviet forces rode to victory in Berlin on American chassis. The arsenal of democracy defeated the Wehrmacht not just with weapons, but with wheels, 427,284 of them, crossing treacherous oceans and vast continents to carry the Red Army to final victory. The American trucks that transformed the Red Army represent more than just machines. They symbolize how the productive capacity of an industrial democracy, shared freely even with an ideological opponent, proved decisive in humanity's desperate struggle against fascism. The Soviet generals who privately admitted they would have lost without American trucks spoke a truth that transcends politics. Modern wars are won not by courage alone, but by the marriage of bravery and industrial might. In the end, the sturdy Studebakers that survived decades of rough service in the Soviet hinterlands outlasted the lies told about them. The veterans knew. The documents proved it. And history now records it. Without American trucks, there would have been no Soviet victory as we know it. The wheels of the arsenal of democracy carried not just supplies, but the hopes of nations to triumph over tyranny. The final irony is that American generosity helped forge the very Soviet superpower that would then spend the next 45 years denying that American contribution ever existed. Yet truth, like those reliable American engines, endures beyond political manipulation. The Soviet generals were right. They would have lost without 400,000 American trucks.